Hi guys, welcome to chapter 2. We're going to cover both sections A and B today, so a little longer lecture. Please make sure you have your books with you and follow along as we go. All right, we're talking about cells, okay? So cells are kind of like the Legos of your body. They're the tiny little building blocks, but they're very functional. They're called functional units, meaning they have, it's more than just structure. They provide very specific functions. This guy named Robert Hooke, back in the 1600s, observed cork cells. He was kind of the first guy to actually observe non-living cells and come up with this idea of them being the building blocks. Some other scientists, and you can see them on page 30 in your books, they kind of worked together and came up with this thing known as the cell theory. And it's 3 observations about cells that still hold true today. One is that all living things are made of cells. Viruses are not actually considered living things because they are not made up of cells. And it could just be made of one cell that's still considered being made of cells. 2, all cells come from other cells. We'll eventually learn about cell division. Now, what's interesting about that point is that what it's telling us is that cells don't just appear out of nothing. And yet the entire basis of evolution was that at some point cells appeared out of nothing. But the cell theory that is still held true today tells us that all cells have to come from other cells. And then the third point is that cells perform the functions of living things. There's a typo there. It's supposed to say the. You'll be fine. All right, moving on. There's lots of different cell types, including the various types of cells you see in your body. Nerve cells, blood cells, muscle cells, liver, blah, 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 blah. But they're kind of classified according to some certain characteristics. Characteristics that we've actually talked about before. Eukaryotes versus prokaryote. Eukaryote has a nucleus. Prokaryote does not have a nucleus. Then there's, the unicellular versus the multicellular organisms, one cell versus multiple cells. Well, then we can keep getting, stacked up on those. You might have an organism that's made up of multiple cells, but those cells actually collect together and perform similar functions. You can have several similar cells working together. That would be considered a tissue, okay? You can have lots of tissues working together, performing a larger function, and that would be considered an organ. So you can have let's see, what's a good example? Your stomach. Your stomach is made up of many different types of cells. The lining of your stomach is a different type of cell than the muscle in your stomach. Lots of different things. So you've got tissue. You've got the lining of your stomach that's a certain kind of tissue, a certain kind of cell. It performs a protective function. Then you've got the muscular tissue and that type of cell that makes up the squeezing portion of your stomach, but all together they create this organ of the stomach that works for your digestive system. And there's lots and lots of examples like that. We'll talk a lot more about the different organs and how they work later in the year with physiology. Lots of parts to a cell. We will spend quite a bit of time on this in class. Probably have some assignments to go along with this, but you should definitely know a lot of these parts, okay? All cells have a membrane around them, and that is basically a fence that controls what can enter or exit the cell, okay? Now, plant cells have an additional rigid structure outside of the cell membrane called the cell wall, and that helps plants have their structure. They don't have a skeleton. That cell wall helps flowers stand up and grass stand up and trees even, okay? But that's only found in plant cells. The nucleus, that's that center part. Let me get my pen. There we go. So you can see this kind of purple ball in the middle of it there. That is the nucleus. That's kind of the control center, the brain of the cell. That's where all the DNA is. And the DNA contains all the instructions for the function of the cell, okay? And we'll talk about those processes as we go. Cytoplasm is the liquid in between the membrane and the nucleus. So kind of this peachy color stuff, that's the cytoplasm. If you imagine cracking an egg into a pan, the yolk would be the nucleus, and all the white of the egg would be the cytoplasm, okay? The endoplasmic reticulum, and you can find that's this stuff right in here, helps produce and transport proteins. The Golgi apparatus, which is this right here, just modifies and also helps transport the proteins. One of the main things of cells is to make, change, and transport proteins. Proteins are a very key part of our functioning bodies. The ribosomes are those little tiny black dots that you see sprinkled throughout the cell. Those actually assemble the proteins. They take the DNA from the nucleus and they translate that into proteins. We'll talk more about that in a later chapter. And then the mitochondria are these little yellow-shaped things. These are like the powerhouses of the cell. They help us produce energy in the form of ATP. We'll talk more about that, okay? Let's talk about the cell membrane in a little more detail now. It is what's known as selectively permeable, which means it doesn't allow everything in. It kind of decides. Some things get to go in, it blocks other things, okay? Now, there's different ways that the items can get into and out of the cell. We're going to talk about these types right now, and then we'll talk about active transport in a minute. So diffusion is what you see in the picture here, and it's the movement through a membrane of a high concentration to a low. So whatever the substance is, it doesn't matter. You could see that there's a much higher concentration of it outside the extracellular space than there is inside the intracellular space. In an enclosed space, if you spray something, let's say you guys with your Axe spray, you spray it in one corner of the classroom, eventually that's going to spread through the whole classroom and people will be able to smell it. That's diffusion, okay? Things of high concentration want to spread out. And so these molecules will gradually move through the membrane. You know, here's a few more coming through until you get to the end here where it's found what's known as equilibrium. They're an equal concentration both inside and out, okay? That's diffusion. Now, osmosis is simply the diffusion of water across the membrane. So sometimes you might have a salty environment. Salt can't pass through this membrane. The cell membrane decides to block the salt for some reason. Well, if you have a high concentration of salt on one side of the cell, the salt wants to move to the lower concentration, but it can't. So what happens is the water moves out to where that high concentration is in an attempt to dilute the salt. That's osmosis, okay? Those are both examples of what's known as passive transport, meaning it does not use energy. Okay, passive, it just happens on its own. So now let's talk about active transport. This requires energy. And frequently what's happening is it could be a size thing. The molecule's too big to get through the membrane, so it needs a special opening which requires energy. Or it's just moving the concentration gradient is what it's called, in an uphill fashion, okay? Diffusion takes a high concentration and goes to low concentration. It's like riding your bike downhill, okay? Sometimes, though, you want to take a low concentration and push it into that higher concentration. That's like riding your bike uphill. It requires more energy, okay? And so you see this special gate here. It requires energy, that ATP that your mitochondria is producing for other things as well. That energy comes in, it opens the gate, and it allows the substance to pass. That is active transport because it requires energy, okay? So let's talk about some evolution versus creation for a minute. And this is in your book. It talks about this on, let's see, on page 37. You feel free to pause this screen and kind of look at these, but I'll talk about it a little bit as well. According to the theory of evolution, that first cell came from an unusual process because the cell theory tells us that cells can't come from nothing. So the theory is that one prokaryote, a cell without a nucleus, doesn't explain where that first prokaryote came from. It engulfed another prokaryote, and that inside prokaryote became the mitochondria, which will eventually produce energy. Eventually, doesn't say how, eventually this prokaryote turns into a eukaryote, meaning it has a nucleus, it's got some DNA in there. It will engulf another prokaryote, and that will become those organelles. So this eukaryotic cell that magically appeared is going to engulf other prokaryotes, and that's going to be the organelle. Again, it doesn't explain where that first prokaryote came from. Creation, some people find creation as hard to believe as I find evolution to believe. They're both theories. Creation tells us simply that God created the cells. The first eukaryotes were probably created on day 3 when he made plants. Plants are eukaryotic cells. And the first prokaryotes probably came on day 5 when he created animals. He probably created the unicellular animals along with the multicellular animals. Now, again, some people find that hard to believe. To me, it sounds like a simpler explanation than, well, this one prokaryote ate another prokaryote, and then it turned into a eukaryote, and then it kept eating other prokaryotes, and look, now we have a functioning cell. They both take a level of faith to believe in them. I choose this one personally, and you're going to hear me talk about that a lot this year. Okay? I think that's it. See you guys later. Have a good day.